Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome to another podcast by George. Well, it just keeps getting better. Our slate of outstanding guests continues on a podcast by George, and I couldn't be more delighted, more tickled with the person that we've got on the line with us this morning. It's Rekha Basu, the columnist, award-winning columnist for the Des Moines Register, and she's agreed to spend a few minutes with us this morning, and I'm really happy about that. So let's get right to it. I want to background her a little bit. Many of our listeners are going to be familiar with her work because of the columns in the Des Moines Register. She's on television, radio. She's pretty ubiquitous. She's been about everywhere. But I'm gonna read this little backgrounder because I love this stuff. It's great. Born in India and raised in New York, New Delhi, and Bangkok, Rekha Basu completed her global multicultural perspective with a move to the heartland. Her columns in the Des Moines Register span politics, culture, human rights, and social justice, and frequently examine the news from a gendered and minority perspective. Basu's columns are distributed nationally by Tribune Content Agency News Service. She's appeared on KCWI's Great Day Morning Show in a weekly segment, and she's the author of the book Finding Her Voice, a compilation of columns on women's struggles and triumphs in the Midwest. Now, her columns have earned her an honorary doctorate of humane letter from Grinnell College, along with a variety of journalism and social justice awards, including the Iowa Women's Hall of Fame, the Iowa Farmers Union, Friends of Iowa Civil Rights, and the Iowa Interfaith Alliance. Well, I mean, it just goes on, but you get the idea from that backgrounder who we're talking to. Rekha, thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thank you, George, and thanks for such a generous introduction. I don't know where you're reading from, but it sure makes me sound more important than I am, so well, thanks.
It's great stuff, and I'm old enough. I've been reading the Des Moines Register since, I was old enough to read. And I remember when you came on back in the day, and I remember thinking at the time, this is going to work. Here's this woman, and she's not from around here. I think she's a foreigner. She's got this funny name, and I give this about 6 months. And and here we are all these many years later, and you're still poking the stick in the eye of some of these folks out there, just call them folks, I guess, and raising these issues and being a beacon of light in the Midwest. How did that happen?
Aren't you kind? Well, it's funny. I really did not give myself more than a year here at most. I actually only planned to come for a year, and because at the time that I got this job, my husband Rob was in news management in Albany, New York, and actually we worked for competing newspapers there, but I was an editorial writer, and I loved the Des Moines Register. It had just won the Pulitzer Prize for public service because of this wonderful series that they did about rape, and I was a big fan of the editor Geneva Overholzer at the time, who talked a lot and wrote a lot about why it was important to have more so-called women's issues on the front page of newspapers, and took that mission seriously. And there just weren't that many women newspaper editors at the time, or that many daily newspapers that shared my political, admittedly progressive political perspective. And I just decided this was a place that I wanted to work for. And they had an opening for an editorial writer. And I had met the person who was the editor of the editorial pages, Dennis Ryerson, at a conference the year before that opening, and really liked what I heard about the paper's perspective. So when the opening arose, I said to Rob, what do you think about moving to Iowa? And he said something to the effect of, over my dead body, are we moving to Iowa?
Yeah.
So as it turned out, there was not a job for him here, but he very gamely agreed that I should pursue my dream, that we would make it work for like a year, which was my thinking also. And then if he didn't find a job out here, I would come back. But as things turned out, the ending was very different. He ended up getting hired for a succession of different jobs here. After I had been here for 10 months, he moved out and eventually ended up becoming a Des Moines Register columnist as well. And the ironic thing about this is that initially Rob felt like more of a foreigner in Iowa than I did, because having lived around the world, I felt that I could really easily fit in anywhere. I didn't have one unique sort of cultural identity, whereas Rob was very much of a Bronx Italian guy, and he stuck out like a sore thumb, you know, the way he talked and the way he honked on his horn and the way he drove and all that stuff. But in the end, it was Rob who grew to really embrace and love Iowa. So we tried moving away one year. We moved to South Florida, and he missed Iowa so much that we came back after a year. And I think that, you know, that was a great thing because Iowa really embraced him and us.
Yeah, I miss him all the time. That guy was a digger. I mean, what a great writer, and his work, I miss it all the time.
Yeah.
And I want to just mention to everybody that we, Rekha and I, share the grief of ALS. Because, of course, that's what struck Rob and ended his career and his life all too soon. And
that's right. It is a devastating illness, and you lost your sister to it 3 years ago?
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. And it went very quickly for us. I can't remember exactly the timeline for Rob. I remember following it in the columns and in the paper and the news as it came along, and then that spectacular ending with the big concert and Bob Dylan coming to town and all of that. I mean, it was, but it never, I mean, I don't know. You just can't shake it. It's still, man, it's tragic. It's sad stuff.
It is.
Yeah.
It's absolutely haunting. He had, you know, we really didn't know much about it except that Rob was a huge Yankees fan because he was from the Bronx, and Lou Gehrig, you know, it was known as Lou Gehrig's disease, and so we had known a little bit about his journey, but when he was diagnosed, there still wasn't that much information and not that many people who were known to have it. And so when they told us he had 2 to 5 years to live, we thought, well, you know, there must be some cure somewhere in the world, right? So, I mean, we looked everywhere. We just kept going to different doctors for a different diagnosis. We explored what was available in India and in China and elsewhere, and it just, to this day, it so confounds me that there are no, I don't know if they're any closer, but there is certainly no cure yet. And
I just had the
medication.
Yeah, I just had the ALS folks on. Sorry to interrupt you, but they confirmed that there is no cure or anything close to it. They have a drug. Have you heard that that they're kind of excited about?
You know, I heard something about that on your podcast, actually.
Yeah, right.
So tell me more about that, as far as you know, because there was, when Rob was sick, there was one drug, Tech it was called, and it only extended your life by about 3 months, but still he took it, and it cost $1,000. I mean, it was ridiculously expensive. So do you know what this drug is?
Well, a new drug is called Radicava, and it's believed to, if it works for the folks that it works for, it can extend life by 33%. But mostly what the ALS folks are still talking about is just taking care of you till the end.
Exactly. And the other thing is, they don't even know if it's one disease because it strikes each patient differently, right? Some people it starts in the throat, and with some people it starts in the limbs, the hands, and it's almost as if each person has a unique disease. Each person has a different lifespan. You look at someone like Stephen Hawking, who died last year, and he lived with it for 35 years or something. I mean, it was extraordinary. So yeah, it's an absolutely hideous illness, and it devastates people and families. But there's one thing that I will say. The people I have known who have had ALS, and since Rob's passing, I've actually heard from a lot of people and gotten to know more people, seem to have an extraordinarily upbeat attitude towards life, you know, and I imagine your sister was like that as well. That they just kind of, they determine to make the most of what they have left of life. And, you know, they don't get angry. Rob never got angry. He just, you know, he didn't want to stop living, but he also did not want to live in a compromised way. Yeah. And so when he went peacefully, and it's heartbreaking, but boy, we really need to find a cure. We really need to find a cure for this.
Oh, he was a great columnist. Yeah, he did a book.
Yes, he did. Yeah, it's called So I'm Talking to This Guy, and it was published by the Des Moines Register. It's a compilation of his columns, and it's a pretty timeless book. You know, he wrote about so many different situations, both political and personal and societal, that are still timeless. And you pick it up and read it, and you can get a good laugh out of it, because Rob was hilarious in his sense of humor. And, some of these pieces bring you to tears because they're very poignant also. He had a lot of heart, a lot of heart. So I have copies of it if anyone is interested in getting one.
I would recommend that, because, those columns, they were golden. But maybe we can come back and talk about Rob's stuff at another time. I don't want to keep you too long today. I wanted to talk about your career and the time that you've spent with the Register. Kind of give us the highlights and bring us up to modern day, if you would.
Okay, so I joined at the end of 1991, 2 days before my birthday, and I had at the time a baby in diapers. He was like 18 months old, and then another one was still living in New York. He was 5, and so juggling that was a little tricky initially, but people were very supportive. I was an editorial writer for the first 2 years here, but I also was contributing at one point. It ended up being about once a week, a signed opinion column. And at some point, the editors said, we really like this, readers like it, would you be interested in doing it on a full-time basis, this column writing? And of course, I was thrilled because, opinion columns, which are written with your own name, under your own name, get to reflect your own opinions and your own personal experiences, as opposed to editorials, which are the institutional viewpoint of a newspaper. And so you don't have to toe anybody's line when you write columns.
Right, you can't hardly go wrong. It's what I believe.
Yeah.
I take it or leave it. Yeah,
exactly.
It's kind of like this podcast. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So you can, you can take very strong opinions, and I have to say to this day that I've never been reined in. I've never been told what not to write or what to write about. Sometimes editors will have suggestions of something they think might interest me, but really it is my own column, and so that has been incredibly rewarding. And as you know, and I think might have made reference to earlier, I do take very strong positions, and they tend to be from a pretty left-wing perspective, and also from a human rights perspective. I was lobbying for gay rights as soon as I moved here because I had some dear friends back in New York who were gay, and I had seen the journey that they went through over there for civil rights and civil liberties, and then came here and saw. I thought that Des Moines was way behind, and Iowa in general was much further behind New York in terms of acknowledging the simple humanity of gay people and then giving them codified legal rights against discrimination. And some of our Rob's and my best friends were a lesbian couple here who helped to educate us about the situation. So we lived through the city council debating this issue, and it was painful to see how much hatred and mistrust there was. And so I wrote about that issue a lot, and I got a lot of hate mail, as you can imagine. And people were just saying, sort of, who are you, New Yorkers, to come here and challenge our way of life and our thinking and our values? And at first, it was a little jarring. I hadn't been used to that kind of sort of public ridicule and anger. And I still, for some reason, have cartons full of this hate mail from over the years because I guess I consider it a badge of honor. I don't know why I saved them, but I do, because it's also kind of historical. For me, it's sort of it charts the historical journey on so many different issues that we have lived through, to the point where now, Iowa became one of the first states that had same-sex marriage. And I'll tell you a funny story. When we moved to Florida, which was after we had been here for 10 years, I had been here for 10 years, it was just kind of, Rob and I were both offered columnist jobs there, and it was a very multicultural place, and Rob said, how many times do you go to the state fair and write about the biggest hog? So maybe it's time to make a move. And it also was the year 2001 of the hanging chads and that contested election. Florida was in the epicenter of everything. Elian Gonzalez was going on there, Janet Reno. So we thought it would be great for news. We went there. We loved the news that was coming through and all of the things to write about, but we missed the sense of community that Iowa had. And when we came back, me led by Rob, I got hundreds of emails after my first column back. And a lot of them said, I never had much respect for you. I actually hated your columns. You were much too leftist for me. But then it turned out that my son was gay, or my friend was gay. And I started looking at society and how many barriers they put up, and I went back to your columns on that issue.
Well, that's Cheney's daughter, right? I mean,
yes, Cheney's daughter Liz, although I wish that she had evolved more in other areas.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
It is definitely an eye-opener and to people, and I'm really glad to have been able to shed some light or give people a voice on that issue. There are so many others, that we're still tackling as a state, and as you and I have talked about in our emails, Steve King embodies a lot of the current sort of divisiveness, political polarization that we have. But I think the state is also changing. The fact that for the first time he came so close to being defeated in his race to continue being a U.S. Representative says a lot about people's evolution, both in his conservative district and in the state as a whole.
It says a lot about his conservative district, I guess. You probably saw the news reports. Since he got thrown off of his committees, he's back in the district having town hall meetings, and I saw some of his devotees up there interviewed, and their theme was he's doing a great job. And this is kind of the crux of my problem with the world, maybe, is, okay, dislike Steve King, however you want to look at it, but the guy is not doing a great job. I don't know how you can say that. He's never sponsored legislation in all the terms that he's been reelected to. He's a pariah in Washington.
Law.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
And he's thrown off of the House Agriculture Committee for the state of Iowa. Yep. And his followers get together and they're interviewed, and they want to make sure that he knows that they believe he's doing a great job. How does that work?
Oh, yes. And not just that, but there was a piece in the Spencer Daily Reporter yesterday. A bunch of his supporters has written to U.S. representatives, to the House leaders, I guess, and demanded that he be reinstated to those positions. Why? What did he ever do? I mean, what did he ever do on the Agriculture Committee to benefit Iowa? Meanwhile, and there's so many different directions one could take this conversation in, but one of them that I find ultimately ironic is, he has been on such a crusade against undocumented immigrants, and yet his district relies on undocumented immigrant labor because they can't find enough people to work in these confinements.
Yeah, who's going to milk the cows? I mean, who's going to do that work if they get rid of those undocumented immigrants? If people don't think about that. Who's going to do the farm work? And California, who's going to pick the broccoli? I don't know.
Exactly. And so, there's kind of a wink and a nod attitude where, you look the other way. Meanwhile, these new immigrants are repopulating your small dying towns and filling the schools and, awakening some communities that have been pretty sleepy. And that's a good thing for everyone. So how you can still whip that up as an issue to divide people by and how it is still successful is beyond me. But on the other hand, I think that the luster of that line of discourse is starting to fade.
God, I hope
and
so.
And I spent some time in King's district before the election just talking to King voters and people who are getting disillusioned by him. And one thing I found is that there are people in his district who are religious and who share his views against abortion rights, which I think is what has kept them at his side for a long time, but are also starting to get involved in international adoptions and find that his rhetoric about other people's babies and all the other stuff that he says about people who are not like us and don't share our white Western cultural values to be quite offensive. And, they just said they couldn't do it anymore. They could not continue to support him. Yeah. So things are changing out there.
I hope so. And before we run out of time this morning, although we can go about as long as I want to go, but the question that I have for you now, you're a much more keen, much more astute, much more current observer of political news than I am. Here's the thing that I'm running into all the time. Well, when I talk to Republicans that I still talk to, they'll tell me they don't like Trump. They don't want to defend him. They don't want to defend Stephen King and people like him. But what they'll always end with, at least it's not Hillary. I mean, I hear that again and again and again. At least we didn't get Hillary. They'll take Trump. They'll take Stephen King. They'll take whatever you've got out there instead of Hillary. And the question is, what is it about Hillary? What was their great fear? Or what is their great fear? What do you think it is?
Well, so I was going to ask you that question. Did you follow up by saying, what is it that you have against Hillary so much?
I get so mad I can't hardly follow up sometimes. I just assume, I think that
conversation breaks down.
Well, are they afraid they're going to take their guns away? Are they, what is it?
So let me call to your attention the way they now talk about Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah.
Have you noticed how uncannily similar that discourse is?
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of it is gender-based, and a lot of it is this kind of indignation that a woman can speak her mind so strongly, which is part of what, a lot of the flack that was directed against me initially was about is, who gives you the right to come here and be so sassy and arrogant and tell us what to think and, call the shots. And Hillary is a strong woman, was a strong woman, and so is Nancy Pelosi, and people who disagree can take that opposition of views a lot better from other men than they can from women. Another thing that I find the logic really kind of twisted about Hillary in some cases because one of the things that she was being faulted for was for Bill Clinton's affairs. Now, I would say she was a victim of that. It's not her fault, right, that he did all of that. And she tried to defend him. And it's unfortunate if in any way in her disbelief or lack of knowledge she contributed to, the wrongdoing that has been alleged by him, not just in terms of having affairs and going outside of his marriage, but also transgressions against women who have since come forward and said that it was not entirely consensual, these passes he was making and so on. But why blame her for that?
I don't know. Yeah. I don't know.
I think there's a lot of sexism still in politics, frankly.
Maybe that's what it is, and it's not on my radar screen, so I'm just flabbergasted when they bring it up. I don't know what they're talking about, but I always flash back to Bill Clinton's first term early on in the health care initiative that he had underway that Hillary was working behind the scenes a lot on.
Yes.
And when that came forward, there was outrage about it, and she made that comment that, well, I could have stayed home and made cookies or something like that.
Right, and people really took that amiss, and I guess it wasn't the most politic thing to say, but she had been a career woman all her life, and,
But to hate somebody, so far down the line, decades, that's crazy. That's just, but that was the first time I'd seen it. There wasn't a lot of commentary about Hillary to that point, but there was outrage about that one little comment.
Yes, that's right. And, because I think it threatened a lot of women who were stay-at-home mothers and thought that she was demeaning what they did. And granted, it wasn't the best way to express that. But I think what she was trying to say is, in being true to myself, I need to do work because this is the whole career trajectory that I've had has been around these kinds of issues.
Yes.
And, do I have to give that up just because I'm a political wife now and because, my husband is president? But people took it so personally, and that's really unfortunate.
Well, again, before I lose you, one thing I did want to touch on, and that because I get a little distressed, I get a little irate. Sometimes I get this coffee in me in the morning, and geez, I just get so mad. You've got to be delighted about the slate of potential Democratic presidential candidates that are coming out, particularly the women.
Oh my gosh, it's incredible!
Yeah.
It's almost dizzying. You can't keep up with everyone, but there are some phenomenal candidates.
Yeah.
There's really sort of a Democratic candidate for every kind of Democrat,
Can I run down? I want to run down some of my favorites. Maybe you can comment or say Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii.
Is she one of your favorites?
Oh God! I mean, I look at these issues and what they have to say about them, and somebody from, of course, I went to Hawaii once. It was a highlight of my life, my wife and I. So we love everything about the place, but I just love her. And I mean, everybody out there is very finely attuned to to ecology. Obviously, they need to be. The environment's huge out there, and boy, she looks to me like she's going to be a real champion of that, and she's very interesting. She's young, bright, articulate. She's a woman. She's, again, what the Democrats want. I just think she's the greatest.
I was going to go and meet her. The Asian Latino Coalition in Iowa was holding a reception for her last Sunday, but then she never made it, I think, because of weather problems.
There's a green initiative that's moving through Congress right now, and she's actually come out opposed to that because it isn't green enough, I think.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Opposed? Yeah, I saw that she was opposed to it, but I didn't realize it was because it wasn't.
It just didn't go far enough, I think, for her.
Interesting.
Yeah, she's really out there, that's great. I'll tell you what, because I think the two greatest threats to America and the world, really, long-term, climate change, and maybe not as long as we would like. And the other thing, and this got to strike right at your heart and mine too, and is this, the media is the enemy.
Oh, my gosh.
Did you see where that guy from the BBC got slugged at that Trump rally earlier this week?
No, I didn't. I missed that. What happened?
Well, a guy wearing a MAGA hat, Make America Great Again, at a Trump rally just walked up and just punched this guy, basically, and said, down with the media or something like that, carrying on about...
You mean the BBC reporter wasn't doing anything?
No, he was just working.
Oh, good heavens. No, that's ridiculous. Yeah, and actually because we are in this wonderfully privileged position at the Register of being able to interview some of these candidates, I really want to ask questions about the media and their regard for the media and its role. Because last time, when Trump ran for president, he broke with years-old tradition and refused to meet with our editorial board.
Yes.
And even refused to let reporters into his events, which is just so counter to the reason why a place like Iowa has the caucuses, the first caucuses, right? That there is so much access to these players. And now, like a petulant schoolboy, he just cuts everybody off and cuts the media out and tweets directly his views, a lot of them being very anti-media. And you're absolutely right. It is a huge threat to democracy because what you're left with then is his line and the fake news coming out of these Breitbart sites that are completely not credible.
Yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. I agree. And, of course, climate change. Climate change, I was just going to say, you look at what's happening here in Iowa these days, and it's like, whoa, I don't remember a winter this bad.
No, and the older you get, the more that strikes. I see it all the time. The way I put it to people is it appears it's climate change, but it appears to me that the climate is in convulsion. It looks to me like the Earth is trying to throw off a parasite, and the parasite is us. And the issues, it's like it's convulsing. That's the way that it looks to me with all of these spasms of weather that we're having. That's the way that it appears to me.
Let me put it this way. The people who I know who are paying close attention to this race, who are on the progressive side, are very interested in Kamala Harris, are interested
out of California.
Right, California, and also interested in... if he does run, and I think he is, Sherrod Brown, and, of course, in Elizabeth Warren. So those are the three. I think that's the triumvirate of people who are across the board progressive on economic issues and policies and, getting corporation out of calling the shots. And that, for me, is actually a number one issue. You were talking about your two number one issues.
Yes.
The ways in which laws and rulings have been rewritten to recognize corporations as people are, I think, among the most destructive things to have happened to our democracy recently. And that just has to be changed.
Yeah, you're singing my wife's song. That's her number one issue as well. Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, good for her.
What do you make of this Amy Klobuchar criticism that's come up over the past week or two? Is that sexism, do you think, or is there any validity to that, or is that just something you're not prepared to talk about yet?
I'm not prepared to really get into that. There's several people who are in this race who have been criticized for the ways in which they treat their staffs. And that's something that really has to be carefully looked into because on the one hand, it's easy for anyone to complain that had a bad relationship with a politician, but on the other hand, I think how one treats one's staff does say a lot about you and your integrity and your values. And so I think those things do matter, but I guess I'm not prepared to say anything definitive because I really don't know the full story yet.
Tell me a little bit about somebody from back in your neck of the woods, or not too far from Rob's neck of the woods anyway. Cory Booker. I saw him on Rachel Maddow this past week, and it's like they were talking about a comic book superhero almost. This guy becomes the mayor of Newark, New Jersey, so he's up there in that huge population area, the Northeast. A building is burning down this several years ago, but the guy runs into a burning building, saves a woman's life, suffers second-degree burns and cuts his hands, and he's a former football player, and I don't know. I'm looking at this guy and I'm thinking, my God, what's not to like about him? What do you know about? Yeah, what do you know about Cory Booker?
Well, I went to hear him. He was here last weekend, and it was, people just loved him. The room was absolutely packed. I think he is a very, very kind and gentle soul who really wants what's right for people. Can he stand up to all of the nastiness of politics, and where does he fall on particular issues? I think he's right on in his views, but I don't know. I don't know if he's going to generate the same kind of excitement that a Bernie Sanders did last time, for example. But I think he's one to really watch. I learned a little tidbit about him that I thought was fascinating. He is a vegan, not just a vegetarian.
I saw that,
but a vegan, right? So he doesn't eat meat or consume dairy, and that's someone who really, I think, is living in accordance with his principles. So I find that very moving. And I also really find very moving the fact that he continues to live in the inner city. And, his campaign has billed him as the only candidate in this race who lives in the inner city still and tries to stay close to people who are without rather than the fat cats. And that's, who has his ear, too. So that's wonderful. So he's definitely a person of integrity and someone to be watched carefully. This is going to be a very tough choice for Democrats. Boy.
Yeah.
I can't wait to see how this plays out.
Yeah, I'm loving it. I mean, it looks to me like a great slate. I suppose there'll be some skeletons come out of some closets and some people will fall out of the race because of that. But right now, I mean, it's looking all good. We've been very generous with your time, Rekha, and I don't want to keep you too long this morning. Is there something I haven't asked about, or something that you'd want to talk, something that's maybe top of mind right now that's going to be a future column here very soon that you'd want to talk about this morning?
Well, just one thing that I'm working on, and I think that is really important for the Iowa legislature to deal with this next session, is in some of my reporting in the past year, I came up with a situation involving a doctor in Harlan, Iowa, who had been sexually abusing his young patients. He was a pediatrician. And it turned out that, of course, the statute of limitations is up now because some of this happened 20 or more years ago. But there's a plethora of patients who spoke to police, and I actually read the police files and their testimonials that were really, really devastating. And the Iowa legislature had a chance in the last session to do away with the statute of limitations on claims for childhood sexual abuse, but they declined to do it repeatedly. So I think, and I have some more stories that I'm going to be writing up soon about survivors of childhood sexual abuse, which are pretty devastating. I really think this is an issue that the legislature needs to take seriously. And what I don't understand is why it has become such a partisan issue. Democrats are in support of this legislation, and Republicans are not. And Republicans are the party supposedly of family values, so I don't get it. Something doesn't compute. But I am going to be pushing for them to pass this bill this session.
It's a house of mirrors is the way I describe it. I feel like I'm living in a fun house sometimes. I don't understand. It just does not
and it's not so much fun
No,
either,
it isn't
right?
fun, is it? Well, and that's great. Again, I want to say thanks to our guest, Rekha Basu, for being on a podcast by George. I've really liked this. We've actually run longer than we normally do. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. Maybe I could circle back and we could do another one of these sometime soon. I'd love to have you on the podcast more often. It'd be great.
I would enjoy that. It's been a lot of fun chatting with you. Thanks for your thoughtful questions.
Well, that's great. Award-winning journalist and columnist for the Des Moines Register, Rekha Basu, today's guest on another podcast by George.